Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on what it's like to grow up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. We're going to be looking directly at psychiatric studies, some fascinating neurological research, and expert analysis to really unpack the potential developmental impacts of this unique kind of upbringing.
So this all leads to a huge central question, one that's going to frame our entire explainer today. Can a system of belief, any system of belief, actually rewire a developing brain? The research we're about to dive into suggests the answer is, well, it's a lot more complicated and, frankly, more fascinating than you might think.
All right, let's start with the hard science. What is the evidence from brain imaging and psychiatric studies actually telling us about the neurological footprint of faith, especially when it's in a high-control environment?
Now, this right here is the core scientific idea we're working with. The key isn't that faith itself is the issue, but that the environment it's taught in, specifically a high-control one, can correlate with really measurable changes in how a young brain grows and functions.
So let's look at the data itself. On the left, you've got this psychiatric study from way back in 1975 that found a pretty startlingly higher rate of schizophrenia diagnoses among witnesses. Now, you fast forward almost 50 years to 2022, and modern brain imaging is finding that high parental religiosity correlates with actual changes in the brain networks of young people. These are two totally different studies, decades apart, but they're both pointing toward potential neurological links.
And if we dig a little deeper into that 2022 study, the researchers saw something really specific. They noticed lower efficiency in what you could call the brain's executive dashboard. The networks that handle our attention, our reasoning, our ability to be flexible in our thinking. And here's the crucial part. While the effects were described as modest, they were statistically significant. It suggests that an environment with really inflexible rules might actually influence how those key cognitive skills develop. So how does this jump from a brain scan to real-world life choices? Let's take a look at how these neurological footprints might actually show up in a young person's education and their ambitions for the future. This quote, which is cited in research on the group's teachings, really just gets right to the heart of it. The official stance often frames college not just as something you don't need, but as something that's an actual spiritual danger. And for a lot of young members, this creates this huge internal conflict between their personal ambitions and their faith. And that conflict becomes crystal clear when you put the paths side by side. On one hand, you have the typical teenage journey of figuring yourself out through college and exploring careers. On the other, you have a very prescribed path that puts all the emphasis on loyalty to the organization, things like preaching and Bible study, often at the expense of those other goals. And what's the consequence of that? Well, a 2022 study in the journal Religion and Education found that this mindset can lead young people to actually suppress their own academic talents. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're taught that worldly success is pointless or even dangerous, you might just stop trying for it. And that can effectively shut the door on your own future autonomy. So what are the psychological gears turning behind all of this? Our next section is going to look at the tools of indoctrination that are detailed in the source material, and specifically, the powerful role that fear can play. A theme that comes up over and over again in expert analysis and in the stories of former members is the doctrine of Armageddon. The teaching of this impending, violent end of the world where only the loyal members survive, well, according to these sources, it can create this constant underlying state of fear and anxiety in kids. In fact, some psychologists have even coined a term for the potential fallout from this: religious trauma syndrome. It's used to describe symptoms that look a lot like PTSD, symptoms that can come from being in this kind of high-fear, high-control religious environment. So how are those fears and doubts handled? Well, experts point to a technique known as thought stopping. The moment a difficult thought or a doubt pops into your head, the trained response isn't to think about it or analyze it. It's to immediately shut it down with a prescribed religious activity, like a prayer or a song. The result is that those negative feelings just get pushed down, never really processed. And all this constant suppression, well, it has huge implications for one of the most basic parts of growing up, just figuring out who you are. So let's explore how identity itself can be shaped within this kind of environment. Researchers who study cults use this term, pseudo-self, to describe what can happen. Think of it like a mask. It's a compliant, group-approved persona that a child learns to wear. And behind that mask, their real, authentic thoughts and feelings get hidden away just to make sure they fit in and stay safe inside the group. And you can see how this process unfolds when independent thinking is actively discouraged, when just asking a question is seen as being disloyal, and when your own personal interests always have to take a back seat to what the group demands. Well, a child's identity can become completely defined by the organization, not by their own inner self.
This quote from a former member just sums up the experience so powerfully. Just imagine that. The idea that you could grow all the way to adulthood without ever really having the chance to develop your own authentic personality, simply because every major belief and every big decision was already made for you.
Okay, so let's try and put all these different pieces together. We've talked about behavioral stuff, intellectual stuff, emotional stuff. Is there a model that can help us understand how all these different pressures actually work together? Turns out there is. An expert named Stephen Hassan developed what he calls the BITE model, and it's cited all the time in the literature as a framework for analyzing high control groups, including, according to his work, Jehovah's Witnesses.
The BITE model is an acronym. It stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotion Control. It basically describes how regulating every single aspect of your life, from who your friends are, to what you're allowed to read, to how you're supposed to feel, creates this total, all-encompassing environment that has a powerful influence over people.
So here's the real takeaway. When you combine all those pressures from all 4 points of the BITE model, the sources we've been looking at suggest they can pose some really significant risks to a child's healthy development. We're talking cognitively, emotionally, and in their basic sense of who they are. And this final quote, man, it just perfectly captures the core finding here. It frames these developmental changes not as some kind of failure, but as an adaptation. The brain is doing what it has to do to survive in a very specific, high-pressure environment. But that survival might come at the cost of what we consider normal growth.
And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. Based on the evidence from all this scientific research and expert testimony, where do we draw the line between a guiding faith and a controlling fear? The answer, it seems, might just lie in the developing mind of a child.